My name is Henry, and this is the story of my journey towards independence. It all started on a cloudy morning in Port Jefferson, New York. I was 9 years old, standing at the bus stop with my mom, Melanie. This day was special because it was my first time riding the bus alone. For me, it felt like the beginning of something important. Mom had woken up early to get me ready. As she adjusted my backpack, I could see a mix of pride and concern in her eyes. "Henry, remember everything we talked about. This is a big step for you," she said, her voice steady but soft. I nodded seriously. "I know, Mom. I'll pay attention and be careful." She smiled and pulled me into a tight hug. "You're braver than many grown-ups, Henry. I'm so proud of you." Her words made my chest swell with pride, but also a little bit of nervousness. I knew how much it meant to her that I was doing this on my own. She worked 2 jobs to take care of us, and she always told me how important it was to be responsible and kind. When the bus finally arrived, my heart started pounding. I turned to give Mom one last look. She waved, forcing a smile through her tears. "Go get them, my son. The world is yours," she whispered. I climbed onto the bus and found a seat by the window. As the bus pulled away, I saw Mom standing there, still waving. I waved back until she was out of sight. Then I took a deep breath and tried to calm my racing heart. Next to me, a lady was reading a book. She glanced up and noticed me staring out the window. "Is this your first time traveling alone?" she asked with a kind smile. "Yes, it is," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "My mom said it's an important step to be more independent." "Well, she's absolutely right," the lady said, nodding. "You seem to be handling it very well. What's your name?" "Henry," I said, feeling a bit more at ease. "Nice to meet you, Henry. I'm Mrs. Davis. You're doing a great job, and I'm sure you'll have a wonderful trip," she said before turning back to her book. Her words made me feel a bit better. I relaxed into my seat and watched the world outside the window. The buildings and trees whizzed by, and I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. I repeated Mom's advice in my head. Always be attentive and respectful, and don't be afraid to ask for help if you need it. The bus ride was quiet, filled with the hum of the engine and the occasional chatter of other passengers. I tried to imagine all the adventures that lay ahead. Little did I know, this simple bus ride would be the start of something much bigger. The bus ride started quietly. I watched the buildings and trees blend together as we moved, feeling a mixture of fear and pride. I was doing this all by myself, and it felt both exciting and a bit scary. Just as I was getting used to the hum of the bus, something happened that made my heart race again. I was staring out the window when I heard a woman shout from the front of the bus, "Oh my God, can someone help? My husband, he's not breathing well." Everyone on the bus turned to look. A man was slumped over in his seat, and his wife was trying to shake him awake. Panic filled the air. I felt frozen, unsure of what to do. Then, a man stood up quickly and made his way to the front. "I'm a nurse," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "Everyone, please give us some space." The bus driver pulled over to the side of the road, and we all waited in tense silence. The nurse was checking the man's pulse and talking softly to the woman who looked terrified. "Please, stay calm," the nurse said. "I've called for an ambulance. They should be here soon." I could hear the distant sound of sirens getting closer. I watched everything, feeling a mix of fear and admiration for the nurse. He was so calm and knew exactly what to do. I whispered a silent prayer for the man, hoping he would be okay. The sirens grew louder, and soon the paramedics arrived. They quickly took over, lifting the man onto a stretcher and carrying him off the bus. The woman followed, tears streaming down her face. The bus was quiet again, but it felt different now. Everyone was thinking about what had just happened. The bus driver announced, "We'll be on our way shortly, folks. Thank you for your patience." As the bus started moving again, I couldn't stop thinking about the man and his wife. I hoped he would be all right. It made me realize how fragile life could be and how important it was to be prepared for anything. A few minutes later, an elderly man with unsteady steps approached the bus conductor. His voice was shaky as he spoke. "Excuse me, sir. I need to get to the station, but I can't find my money." The conductor looked frustrated. "Sir, if you can't pay, you can't ride," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. The old man looked around, confused and helpless. My heart tightened at the sight. I knew I had to do something. I stood up and walked over to the conductor, pulling out my small wallet. "Here," I said, handing the conductor my allowance money. "This should cover his fare." The conductor looked at me with surprise. Then his expression softened. "Well, that's very generous of you, young man," he said, accepting the money. The old man looked at me, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, son," he said, his voice quivering. "I don't know what I would have done without you." I smiled at him. "It's no problem, sir. My mom always says we should help others when we can." As I returned to my seat, I felt a warm sense of satisfaction. I didn't need any recognition. Just knowing I had helped was enough. The other passengers murmured their approval, and some even smiled at me. The bus continued its journey, and I felt a little more grown-up, a little more capable. I knew my mom would be proud. As the bus continued its journey, I couldn't help but glance back at the elderly man I had helped. He had found a seat and was sitting quietly, his eyes fixed on the floor. The bus was filled with the hum of the engine and the quiet conversations of passengers, but my mind was still on the events of the day. We finally reached my stop. I gathered my things and made my way to the door. As I stepped off the bus, I heard a voice behind me. "Young man, wait a moment." I turned to see the elderly man carefully making his way towards me. He reached out and gently touched my shoulder. "Thank you again for your kindness. My name is Bernard." I smiled at him. "It was nothing, Mr. Bernard. My name is Henry." Bernard's eyes were soft and full of gratitude. "You don't understand, Henry. What you did meant a lot to me. In a world that often forgets to look sideways, you saw me. You helped me without asking for anything in return." I felt a warmth spread through me. My mom always says that helping others is the most important thing we can do. Bernard nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Your mother is a wise woman. She's raised a good boy." We stood there for a moment in comfortable silence, the bus pulling away behind us. "Would you like to walk with me a bit?" Bernard asked. "I'd like to hear more about you." "Sure," I said, feeling a mix of curiosity and excitement. As we walked, Bernard shared stories from his past. He talked about his days working as a carpenter, the joys and hardships of his life, and how he now spent most of his days alone. His voice was calm and soothing, and I found myself hanging on to every word. At one point, he stopped and looked at me seriously. "Henry, what you did today was more than just an act of kindness. It reminded me that there's still goodness in the world, that people still care." I looked up at him, feeling a bit shy under his intense gaze. "I just did what felt right. And that's what makes it so special," he said, smiling warmly. We continued walking until we reached a small park. Bernard seemed to have a new energy about him. "I come here often," he said, pointing to a bench under a large oak tree. "It's my favorite spot to sit and think." We sat down, and I told him about my mom, how hard she worked, and how she always taught me to be kind and respectful. Bernard listened intently, nodding every now and then. "You have a good heart, Henry," he said finally. "Never lose that. The world needs more people like you." I felt a surge of pride at his words. "Thank you, Mr. Bernard. I won't forget what you've said." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, I knew it was time to head home. Bernard walked me to the edge of the park. "I hope we can meet again, Henry," he said. "I'd like that," I replied. "Take care, Mr. Bernard." "You too, Henry, and thank you again." As I walked the rest of the way home, I felt a lightness in my step. Helping Bernard had given me a new sense of purpose. When I finally got home, I couldn't wait to tell my mom about my new friend and the lessons I had learned that day. It felt like the beginning of a new chapter in my life, one where kindness and connection were at the heart of everything I did. The next morning at school started like any other. I was halfway through my math class when the intercom crackled to life. "Henry, please come to the principal's office," the secretary's voice announced. My classmates whispered and speculated as I packed my things and left the room. I walked down the hall, my heart pounding with a mix of curiosity and nervousness. What could this be about? When I reached the principal's office, I was surprised to see a well-dressed man waiting there. He stood up as soon as I entered, extending his hand with a warm smile. "You must be Henry," he said. "I'm Edward, Bernard's son." I shook his hand, feeling a little shy. "Nice to meet you, sir." "Please call me Edward," he said. "Your act of kindness towards my father meant a great deal to us. He hasn't stopped talking about you." I felt a blush creep up my cheeks. "I'm glad I could help." Edward handed me an envelope. "This is a token of our gratitude. My family and I wanted to do something special for you." I opened the envelope and found a letter inside. It was a scholarship for a youth leadership program I had always dreamed of joining, but never thought I could afford. Tears welled up in my eyes as I looked up at Edward. "Thank you so much," I managed to say. "This means the world to me." Edward smiled. "You earned it, Henry. Your kindness and compassion are qualities that will take you far in life." He asked if he could come home with me to share the news with my mom. I nodded eagerly, excited to see her reaction. The walk home was filled with Edward telling me more about his father and their family. I felt a connection forming, one that went beyond just the events of the bus ride. When we reached my house, my mom was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. She looked up, surprised to see me with a stranger. "Mom, this is Edward," I said. "He's Mr. Bernard's son." Edward stepped forward, extending his hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Melanie. Your son is quite remarkable." My mom shook his hand, a puzzled look on her face. "Thank you. What's all this about?" We sat down at the kitchen table, and I handed her the envelope. As she read the letter, her eyes filled with tears. She looked at me, then at Edward. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This is an incredible gift." "Your son has a bright future ahead of him," Edward said. We wanted to show our appreciation for his kindness. We talked for a while longer, sharing stories and laughter. My mom and Edward seemed to hit it off, and I could see a genuine friendship forming. It felt like our family was growing in a way I had never expected. After Edward left, my mom pulled me into a hug. "I'm so proud of you, Henry. You've always had a big heart, and now others are seeing it too." I hugged her back, feeling a deep sense of joy and fulfillment. Helping Mr. Bernard had led to so many wonderful things, and I knew this was just the beginning. I couldn't wait to see what the future held for us, and I was ready to face it with the same kindness and compassion that had brought us here. The next few days passed by in a blur of excitement. I could hardly wait to tell my friends at school about the scholarship. But what thrilled me most was seeing how happy my mom was. She worked so hard for us. And now something good was finally happening because of me. One afternoon after school, Edward visited our house again. He had called ahead, and Mom had made sure the house was tidy. I was doing my homework at the kitchen table when he arrived. "Hello, Henry," Edward said as he walked in, carrying a box. "How are you?" "I'm great, Edward. Come on in," I replied, closing my textbook. Mom joined us, smiling warmly. "Hello, Edward. It's nice to see you again." "Nice to see you too, Melanie," Edward replied, placing the box on the table. "I brought something for both of you." Mom and I exchanged curious looks as Edward opened the box. Inside were 3 beautifully wrapped packages. He handed one to me and one to Mom. "Go ahead, open them," he said, his eyes twinkling with excitement. I tore open the wrapping paper to reveal a sleek new tablet. "Wow!" I exclaimed. "Thank you so much." Mom's package contained a beautiful set of kitchen knives. "These are amazing, Edward. You really shouldn't have," she said, her eyes glistening with tears. Edward smiled. "You both deserve it. Henry, your scholarship is just the beginning. This tablet will help you with your studies and keep in touch with your new friends from the program. And Melanie, I thought you might enjoy something nice for the kitchen, considering how much you love cooking." "Thank you," Mom said, her voice full of emotion. "You've been so generous to us." Edward waved it off. "It's the least I could do. You've raised an incredible young man. His kindness and bravery have touched our lives in ways you can't imagine." We spent the next hour talking and laughing. Edward shared more stories about his father, Mr. Bernard, and how he was doing much better now. It felt like we were old friends, even though we had only just met. After Edward left, Mom and I sat on the couch, looking at our gifts. "I still can't believe all of this is happening," I said, holding the tablet in my hands. Mom smiled and put her arm around me. "You earned it, Henry. Your kindness and willingness to help others have brought us here. I'm so proud of you." Her words filled me with a warm glow. I knew that this was more than just about the scholarship or the gifts. It was about the connections we were making and the lessons we were learning. The next day, I took my new tablet to school to show my friends. They were all impressed, but what made me happiest was seeing how proud they were of me. My teacher, Ms. Parker, even asked me to share my story with the class. I stood at the front of the room, feeling a little nervous but mostly excited. Last week, I helped an elderly man on the bus who couldn't find his money. His name is Mr. Bernard. Because of that, his son Edward gave me a scholarship to a youth leadership program. The class clapped, and Ms. Parker beamed at me. "That's wonderful, Henry. You're a great example of how a small act of kindness can lead to amazing things." As I sat back down, I felt a sense of pride and fulfillment. I realized that the reward wasn't just the scholarship or the gifts. It was knowing that I had made a difference in someone's life, and in return, my life had changed in ways I had never imagined. That evening, as Mom and I sat down to dinner, she looked at me with a proud smile. "You know, Henry, I think this is just the beginning. There are so many more adventures and opportunities ahead of you." I nodded, feeling the same excitement I had felt when I first boarded the bus alone. "I can't wait to see what happens next." And with that, we enjoyed our meal, sharing stories and laughter, knowing that no matter what the future held, we would face it together, with kindness and compassion leading the way. The days following Edward's visit were filled with a sense of new possibilities. My mom and I had found not just friends, but a new connection that felt like family. Every few days, Edward would drop by, and we'd talk about everything, from my progress in school to his latest projects at work. These visits became a highlight of our week. One sunny Saturday, Edward invited us to his father's house for lunch. Mom and I were both excited and a little nervous. We had grown close to Edward and Bernard, and this felt like an important step in our new friendship. As we arrived at Bernard's house, he greeted us with a warm smile. "Welcome, welcome. Come in, he said, ushering us inside. The house was cozy and filled with the smell of something delicious cooking. Edward was in the kitchen, wearing an apron and looking quite at home. "Hello, Henry." "Hello, Melanie. I hope you're hungry," Edward called out, stirring a pot on the stove. Mom laughed. "It smells wonderful in here. What are you making?" "Just a little family recipe," Edward replied with a grin. "I thought we could all use a good meal and some quality time together." We sat down at the dining table, and Bernard joined us. He looked much healthier and happier than when I first met him on the bus. "Henry, it's so good to see you again," Bernard said, his eyes twinkling. "You've become quite the hero in our family." I felt a blush rise to my cheeks. "I'm just glad I could help." Edward brought out the food, and we all dug in. As we ate, the conversation flowed easily. We talked about school, work, and shared stories from our past. At one point, Bernard turned to my mom. "Melanie, you've raised an incredible son. He's wise beyond his years." Mom smiled, her eyes glistening. "Thank you, Bernard. He's always been special." After lunch, we moved to the living room, where Edward brought out a photo album. "I thought you might like to see some old pictures," he said, sitting down beside us. We spent the next hour flipping through the album, laughing at the old photos and sharing more stories. It felt like we had known each other forever. As the afternoon turned into evening, Edward and my mom found themselves deep in conversation about their hopes and dreams. I could see a spark between them, something more than just friendship. "Edward, I have to say, you've been such a positive influence in our lives," Mom said, her voice soft. Edward reached out and took her hand. "And you both have brought so much joy to ours. I feel like we found something special here." I watched them, feeling a mixture of happiness and hope. It was clear that this connection was growing into something more meaningful. As we prepared to leave, Bernard pulled me aside. "Henry, you've brought so much light into our lives." "Thank you." I smiled up at him. "I'm glad I could help, Mr. Bernard." He patted my shoulder. "You've done more than help. You've shown us the true meaning of kindness and family." On the ride home, my mom and I talked about the day. "Henry, I think we found something really wonderful with Edward and Bernard," she said, her eyes sparkling with happiness. "I think so too, Mom," I replied. "It feels like we're part of a bigger family now." As we pulled into our driveway, I looked over at my mom. "Do you think this could be the start of something new for all of us?" She smiled and nodded. "Yes, Henry, I think this is just the beginning." That night, as I lay in bed, I felt a sense of peace and contentment. Our lives had changed in ways I never imagined, all because of a small act of kindness on a bus. I knew that whatever the future held, we would face it together, with the same spirit of compassion and love that had brought us here. The following months brought more visits, shared meals, and laughter. It became clear that our two families were blending into one. Edward and my mom grew closer with each passing day, their bond deepening into something special. One Friday evening, we decided to have dinner at our house. Mom was in the kitchen, bustling around as she prepared a feast. I was setting the table when the doorbell rang. "I'll get it," I called, running to the door. Edward and Bernard stood there, each holding a dish they had prepared. "Good evening, Henry," Edward greeted, handing me a warm casserole dish. "Hi, Henry," Bernard added with a smile. "We brought dessert." "Come on in," I said, leading them to the dining room. Mom appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel. "Hello, Edward." "Hello, Bernard. It's so good to see you." Edward gave her a warm hug. "It's good to see you too, Melanie. We've been looking forward to this all week." We sat down to eat, the table laden with delicious food. The conversation flowed easily, filled with stories and laughter. It felt like every meal together brought us closer, knitting our lives together in ways I hadn't expected. After dinner, we moved to the living room. Edward and Mom sat on the couch, talking softly. Bernard and I settled into comfortable chairs nearby. "Henry, I have to tell you," Bernard began, his voice filled with emotion. "You and your mom have brought so much joy into our lives. I haven't felt this happy in years." I smiled at him. "We feel the same way, Mr. Bernard. It's like we've all found something we were missing." Bernard nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Family. We've found a family." Meanwhile, on the couch, Edward and Mom's conversation had taken a serious turn. I could hear bits and pieces of their discussion about the future, hopes, and dreams. Edward reached for Mom's hand, his voice soft but earnest. "Melanie, I've been thinking a lot about us, about this connection we've built," Edward said, looking into her eyes. "I feel like we're meant to be together, like we're building something real and lasting." Mom's eyes filled with tears. "Edward, I feel the same way. You've brought so much happiness into our lives. I never thought I'd find someone who understands and cares for us the way you do." Edward smiled, gently squeezing her hand. "I want to be there for you, for Henry, for all of us. I want us to be a family." Tears spilled down Mom's cheeks as she nodded. "Yes, Edward, I want that too." Seeing them together, so happy and connected, filled me with a deep sense of joy. I had always wanted a family, and now it felt like that dream was coming true. The next few weeks were filled with even more shared moments and plans for the future. Edward and Mom decided to take things one step at a time, but it was clear they were both committed to building a life together. One sunny afternoon, we all gathered in the park where I had first walked with Bernard. We brought a picnic and spent the day enjoying the warm weather and each other's company. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Edward stood up and cleared his throat. "I have something I'd like to say," he began, drawing everyone's attention. He turned to my mom and me, his eyes full of emotion. "Melanie, Henry, Bernard, I want you all to know how much you mean to me. These past few months have been some of the happiest of my life. I found a family with you, and I couldn't be more grateful." Mom reached for his hand, tears in her eyes. "We feel the same way, Edward." Edward continued, his voice steady and filled with love. "I want to spend my life with you, Melanie, and be a father to Henry. I want us to build a future together." I looked at Bernard, who was smiling broadly, and then back at Mom. Her face was a mix of joy and love. "Yes, Edward," she said, her voice trembling. "We want that too." We all embraced, tears of happiness streaming down our faces. In that moment, I knew we were no longer just two families brought together by chance. We were one family, bound by love, kindness, and a shared future. As we packed up our picnic and headed home, I felt a sense of peace and contentment. Our lives had changed in ways I never could have imagined, all starting with a simple act of kindness on a bus. Now we were building a new life together, filled with love and the promise of many happy years to come. And so, our journey continued, not as separate individuals, but as a united family, ready to face whatever the future held, together.